welcome to our third installment of First Sunday Fireside Chats. I'm your host, Lance Blair, Docent Training Coordinator and Communications Manager here at Historic Camden. Today our topic of discussion is Nathanael Greene in Rev War era Camden. And to discuss that, I am joined by my very special guest, Dr. Jim Piecuch, who is going to get on the ball here. We're going to talk about Nathanael Greene and how he ended up in Camden. And as a little bit of background, I'll start by saying that many of you already know that the Battle of Camden was a tragic loss for the Patriot forces. And Horatio Gates, the Continental commander during that time and leader of the Southern Campaign, was subsequently removed after that tragic loss and replaced with Nathanael Greene, who then came in and took control of the Southern Campaign and eventually made his way to Camden, which is where you come in. And if you could tell us, Jim, about how that came to be and how Greene played into the Camden portion of the campaign and the British occupation.
Okay, well, Nathanael Greene shows up at Charlotte at the beginning of December 1780 to replace Gates, and a lot of the officers are expecting some what they call unpleasantness, because Gates was considered a rival to Washington. There were a lot of people in Congress who wanted to replace Washington with Gates in 1778, and Washington had his own group of supporters, among whom was Nathanael Greene, Washington's protege, and people thought it was going to be difficult, especially since Greene had been authorized by Congress to conduct an inquiry into Gates's conduct leading up to, at, and immediately after the Battle of Camden. Surprisingly enough, they have a very polite, if not completely pleasant, but at least nothing
Too dramatic.
Yeah, nothing too dramatic. No animosity was shown. Gates handed over the command. Greene took over. And Greene decided Charlotte was a poor place for him to be. The area had been picked over. Cornwallis had advanced to Charlotte in September 1780 and stayed there for a while after the Battle of Camden before withdrawing. So the area had been picked over. There was no food. There was no supplies. So Greene decided to do something contrary to the accepted rules of warfare and split his force. You're not supposed to do that in the face of a superior enemy, and yet Cornwallis with a larger army was at Winnsboro. Greene took much of the army to Cheraw, where there was a greater number of provisions available so his troops could subsist, and he sent Daniel Morgan. Morgan had been drawn out of retirement by Gates, but had arrived too late for the Battle of Camden, so Greene is the one who benefits from Morgan's presence. He sends Morgan with some of the Continental troops, his Continental cavalry, and a large portion of militia to the area around 96, where he wants to spirit up the inhabitants and keep them encouraged to oppose the British.
Right.
Cornwallis plays right into Greene's hands. He also divides his army. So he sends Bannister Tarleton with part of the army after Morgan. Morgan, of course, defeats Tarleton at Cowpens, at which point Cornwallis, who had not even left his camp to aid Tarleton, even though 3 days before Cowpens he said, "I'm marching today to join you," but somehow he hadn't gotten around to striking the tents. Cornwallis now decides he's going to pursue Morgan, his main goal being to recapture the 600 prisoners of war he had lost at Cowpens, who were valuable troops, hard for the British to replace. So Cornwallis, of course, before leaving, he could have easily detailed a regiment or two to burn the excess baggage, but instead he spends 2 days with his whole army burning the baggage, which gives Morgan a head start. Greene, on learning that Cornwallis is in pursuit of Morgan, marches his troops into North Carolina, where they link up with Morgan. Cornwallis chases them, but they just barely get away in what's called the Race to the Dan. Greene escapes to Virginia, gets reinforcements, refits, comes back, fights Cornwallis at Guilford Courthouse. Cornwallis wins the battle, but loses about a quarter of his army and retreats to Wilmington. So Greene follows Cornwallis most of the way to Wilmington, and then he makes what is a very bold decision, even bolder than his decision to split his army, and is really the crucial decision of the war for the Americans. Greene decides he can't get at Cornwallis in Wilmington. Cornwallis can escape by sea to British naval superiority. He can maybe march out and attack him. He can be reinforced. There's 3,000 troops sitting in garrison at Charleston who could very easily be moved by ship to Wilmington.
Right.
Greene looks and he said, you know, if I march into South Carolina, the British technically have about 5,000 regular troops in South Carolina. But 3,000 of those troops are in Charleston, about 1,500 are in Camden and the surrounding area. A few are in Georgetown, a few are at 96, there are others are at various posts. So with his army, if he can get militia support, he can basically conduct what he calls a war of posts, taking one British post after another, driving them from South Carolina. The big gamble in this is what happens if Cornwallis leaves Wilmington and follows Greene back to South Carolina, because then Greene is going to be caught between two British forces. So it is a huge risk. Fortunately for Greene, Cornwallis decides to march to Virginia and Yorktown, so Greene's plan works, but he's still got to carry it out successfully. And like Gates, he has familiarized himself with the area. He knows the key post he has to move against first is Camden. Right. And so that is what he sets out to do in late April of 1781.
So Gates, after being taken out of command, Greene is busy for those next few months. Now, the British, can you talk a little bit about the British occupation and how that played into planning for Greene, what the British were doing during that time played into Greene's plans to try and take Camden back?
Well, the British are in limbo. There's a letter I found, it's actually in archives in New Brunswick in Canada, dated April 26th, 1781, the day after the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill. It's from Cornwallis' protege and the commandant in Charleston, Lieutenant Colonel Nisbet Balfour. And it is this plaintive letter to Cornwallis at Wilmington saying, where are you? Where are you going? What are you going to do? And it's actually 2 days after, 2 days before that letter was dated, Cornwallis left for Virginia. But Balfour says, if you want to come back, I can send shipping to transport you back to Charleston. I can send you to Georgetown. Do you need supplies to come back overland? Balfour and Rawdon here at Camden are not fully aware of what Cornwallis intends. They know he's fought a battle at Guilford Courthouse, but most of their reports are coming either from intelligence that loyalists have gathered or from prisoners. So they're in a position where they don't know what is happening. And Cornwallis has reported Guilford Courthouse as a magnificent victory. So is everything said? Is South Carolina secure? And Rawdon, until loyalist agents bring him reports that Greene is marching down to Camden, has no idea what's going to happen. He has been very busy and actually very effectively conducting anti-partisan operations. He has carried out some operations against Sumter, which forced Sumter to fall back, although Sumter escaped capture because one of Rawdon's officers did not block the route Rawdon told him to block. He got a brighter idea and said, no, Sumter's not going to go that way, he's going to go here. And of course, Sumter went the way Rawdon predicted.
Taking liberties.
Yeah, and then he had just conducted an operation earlier that month against Francis Marion. He sent somebody who's going to come back to Camden after the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill, Lieutenant Colonel John Watson of the Guards, with a force of light infantry and other units. Right. They marched from Camden to Georgetown, knowing that Marion is going to be drawn to that threat. And Marion is, in fact, totally drawn to Watson. There's a lot of inconclusive fighting. Watson does make it to Georgetown, but suffers fairly significant casualties. But while Marion is busy with Watson, another regiment of Rawdon's own troops, the Volunteers of Ireland, along with Harrison's Rangers, which is a loyalist unit for the PD region, find Marion's base at Snow's Island, kill or capture the small number of troops guarding it, and destroy all Marion's supplies. So Marion has actually, at the time he finds out that Greene has come back, Marion has prepared to abandon the fight in South Carolina and withdraw to North Carolina. So that had been a serious blow that Rawdon struck. Greene coming back is going to turn the situation around. One of Marion's men describes how when Lee's Legion arrived at Marion's camp, they were seen approaching the vanguard of the Legion, that some of these hard partisan fighters were actually in tears, knowing that they would have a chance again to stay and fight. And of course, Rawdon is now, he's got more than 1/3 of his force at Georgetown. He's here in Camden. Now Greene's coming with a force of larger size. What is he going to do? He has to now prepare to conduct operations, not knowing what his commander in Cornwallis' plans are.
A lot of uncertainty.
Yeah,
for
definitely.
sure. So, sounds like we have our players. We know who's involved. So, Greene is on the march. Rawdon is sort of babysitting Camden to a certain degree. I don't know if that term would work, but as I said, kind of in limbo. So, Greene makes it to Camden. Well, close.
Yeah.
Not quite. That's the problem, I guess. So, we've got Greene, we've got Rawdon, we've got two movable object meets an irresistible force, I suppose. So, what happens? We've got the Battle of Hobkirk Hill, or often known as the Second Battle of Camden by many people. And a battle that is, I think, too often either forgotten or overlooked. I think it's a really kind of seminal battle in the war. It made had a lot of ripple effect, even though it might not have been the largest scale. It had a lot of ripple effects through what happened with the subsequent evacuation and that kind of thing. And there was a lot of ripple effects. So can you tell us about the battle and how the fallout sort of came about?
Sure. Greene basically adopts a strategy very similar to that of Gates. He is going to get close to Camden and threaten the garrison and try to cooperate with the partisan leaders to cut off their supplies. And then he is going to, he hopes, force Rawdon to either withdraw or come out and attack him on strong ground. So he detaches, as I mentioned, Henry Lee's Legion to collaborate with Marion. First target Fort Watson, which is a crucial link in the supply line between Camden and Charleston. And this is going to succeed. Greene is very good at understanding his men. He knows Henry Lee is a serious egotist and is always looking for glory. And so initially he thought of sending Lee to work with Sumter, but he, with the frustration he had during the Confidence campaign trying to get Sumter to aid Morgan, which never materialized, he knows that Sumter is also an egotist and that if you put Sumter and Lee together, they're going to butt heads. But he knows that Marion is willing to put aside ego for the sake of the cause. Right. So he makes the wise decision, put Marion and Lee together. They go to Fort Watson, which they're going to capture 2 days before the battle here. Greene then comes to Camden and he tries a bunch of methods to get Rawdon to come out and attack him. He captures Logtown, which is just north of where the post office and the main intersection of Camden now is. It's a little subsidiary of Camden. The British have only a small force there. Rawdon doesn't want to reinforce it, but he couldn't pull them out fast enough because he didn't realize Greene was so close. But the British are driven out of Logtown. That doesn't draw Rawdon out. William Washington with the cavalry attacks one of the redoubts northwest of town. There's a house inside the fortifications. He sends fire to it with his artillery. Rawdon doesn't come out. Greene marches around a little bit north of town, hoping that this will lure Rawdon out. Rawdon doesn't come out, so then he goes and puts himself in position on Hobkirk's Hill to wait. And he's going to get his wish, but sometimes you really shouldn't wish for something.
As the old saying goes, yeah.
Yeah. So Rawdon decides he is going to attack him. A deserter leaves Greene's camp, comes into town with some information. He gives them good information on Greene's strength. Greene only has about 1,500 men. Sumter's militia has not arrived, even though Sumter is always on the way, but he just never gets here. Other militia has not arrived. He does have 250 North Carolina militia, but he has them a little farther in the rear where Dusty Bend is now.
Yeah.
And So they don't participate. So he only has 1,500 men of all arms, infantry, cavalry, artillery. The deserter reports that Greene has sent his artillery away, which was true at the time the deserter left, but after the deserter left, the artillery came back. But Rawdon figures, I've got to do something. I can't sit here. So he pulls all of his troops together. He gets about 900 some odd men, between 900 and 950. That includes convalescing sick from the hospital. That includes his musicians. He's not using the fifers and drummers. They're all going to carry muskets now. And he's going to attack. He leaves Camden's fortifications defended by armed slaves. He arms the slaves who have come into the British lines and the local militia. He couldn't keep all the militia. When the Americans were coming back and word of it started circulating in parts of North and Upper South Carolina, a lot of militia units sent emissaries saying, can we come in and help? Rod didn't have the weapons or the food to support them, so he had to say thank you, but he did have the local Camden loyalist militia. So they defend the town, and what Rawdon does is, he says, I can't leave the palisaded town without Greene noticing from there on the hill, and he's got pickets going down the hill. So he leaves the south gate. Through the south gate, not even trying to hide it, flags flying, the drummers are playing their drums and fifes for this, then they're going to put them away and pick up their muskets. And he marches just a short distance to Pine Tree Creek, and then he turns and begins following Pine Tree Creek northwest through the woods to flank the American position on Hobkirk's Hill. So that is the stage. The Americans they have a picket line out, but they're not really expecting an attack. Some of them are eating breakfast, some of them are laundering their clothes. In the park up there is a pond, you've seen it. And also on the other side of the polo fields, there's another little pond area where there's a stream. So at both flanks, the men are watching. I believe it's General Hugie, who commands the 2 Virginia Continental Regiments on the left, who said he was soaking his feet in the water.
See, this battle was different than Camden, I think, in terms of timing, because the Battle of Camden took place basically just before the break of day, really. Yeah. This was in daylight. Yeah. This is a little bit different, and I guess they, to some extent, caught Continental Army napping almost, or in an inconvenient time. So this was almost coincidentally well planned. Yeah, and John Eager Howard, the Maryland officer who was, Greene said he deserved a statue of gold as much as any Greek or Roman military hero. That's high praise coming from anybody. And absolutely. Howard wrote after the war, when he was corresponding with some people about that battle, and he said the fact is the troops were just caught off guard and they never recovered their balance and ended up behaving badly. So they come out now, Pine Tree Creek forks. So Rawdon actually followed from his direction the left-hand fork, which brought him out earlier than he had planned. He didn't realize the fork, but he wasn't at the head of the march, although his regiment, the Volunteers of Ireland, were in the vanguard. So they followed the fork, and they come out at the, not quite the extreme left of Greene's line, but almost, or the 2nd Maryland Regiment. That we've got the 1st and 2nd Virginia on the west side of the road, and the 1st and 2nd Maryland on the east side, and the artillery is in the road, which was at that time very wide. So, and is where the road is today, of course, going up Fireside. Not positioned the way they anticipate. So now you have two sides that are, even I guess by some measure, the British accidentally caught themselves off guard in some way by coming out a bit early. So you've got these two forces that meet. So how does that engagement go? I mean, how does it, I think we probably know the outcome, but we didn't just get there.
That's right. The American pickets managed to fire a few shots and then get back to their units. The American officers start ordering their drummers to beat people to arms, the drum beat. Right. People start getting their arms, trying to form line of battle. The 2nd Maryland is a fairly new regiment. They had only fought at Guilford Courthouse, and they had fled there from the British Guards. The 1st Maryland, of course, is a veteran. It's a consolidation of the 7 regiments that had fought at Camden, that had been fighting at Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse. So they're very experienced.
Tried and true.
And the two Virginia regiments are also new. They had fought at Guilford Courthouse. That was their first time in action. They had done fairly well, but not well enough to enable Greene to hold the field there. And they're on the other side of the road anyway, so they're not going to be engaged right away. When this action starts, Greene looks and he sees that the British are advancing on a relatively narrow front. So he immediately thinks, God, this double envelopment. I can attack them on both flanks and envelop them. So he orders the Marylanders to make that move and orders the Virginians to start coming and swinging forward. So Rawdon sees this, though, while it's taking place, and instantly starts rushing his troops from column into line of battle to extend his line. As the Continentals start pushing down the hill, the Marylanders, somebody kills the Captain William Beatty of the right flank company in the 1st Maryland unit that they all form on. And Beatty's men get into confusion. They stop advancing. The commander of that regiment, Colonel John Gunby, instead of ordering that company forward or just telling the commander to reorganize them who are second in command and then get them up in line, maybe even extend to try to link up with the Virginians, he orders his whole regiment to halt and draw back and realign with the 1st company because they're supposed to be aligned to your right. And it is a tactical mistake. It exposes the right flank of the 2nd Maryland. It also exposes the flank of the Virginians. So Rawdon is now getting his troops in line. He is able to force back the 2nd Maryland. The 1st Maryland never really recovers its balance, and they end up being pushed backward. Where Rawdon has potential trouble is if the Virginians can get fully into action. And there's never been a really satisfactory explanation for what happened with them. There certainly wasn't a whole lot. The archaeology indicates there wasn't a whole lot of fighting there. There was some fighting. But as Rawdon tried to get the rear units in his column across what we'll now call Broad Street, which is where the artillery is, to engage the Virginians on the American right flank, the artillery is there, and the artillery is doing a lot of damage to the British as they cross in the open. So they are taking these losses. They do engage the Virginians somewhat, but the Virginians, Greene wrote, they got into confusion.
And they're almost a non-factor.
Yeah, they're really almost a non-factor. Interestingly enough, the South Carolina Royalists, which is a provincial regiment from South Carolina, we think they were one of the units that crossed the road. They didn't have many casualties either. None of these units seem to have been heavily involved. We're not sure exactly, even if the Royalists did cross the road. There's some evidence, but it's sketchy. So, we're not sure how many British units ended up west of Broad Street. The Virginians somehow, maybe it was just making a complicated maneuver down a wooded hill when you're not ready and there's a lot of noise off to your left. In any case, Greene looks, well, actually he plays one other card that needs to be mentioned. He tells William Washington to take his cavalry around the British right flank and hit their infantry line from the rear as they're charging up the hill. Slightly risky idea, but a potentially good one if Washington does what he's told. Washington, for some reason, never carries out the part of his order to attack the infantry. He basically finds the British field hospital. There are surgeons, there are wounded men, there are malingerers, hey, the gunfire is pretty heavy. I think all 3 of us need to help Charles back to the aid station. And so what Washington does is he takes these people prisoner and then begins paroling them to release them because he can't take, we'll take some people on the backs riding doubled up with his cavalry. And while he's doing that, Rawdon's troops push the Marylanders off of Hobkirk's hill. The Virginians are in disorder, so Greene orders them to fall back, and Greene has to withdraw from the field. Washington comes back. But Greene had the right ideas. He could not get the execution.
And there was too much disarray for. He had a grand plan. He was going to orchestrate this grand symphony, but all the instruments weren't playing a tune. It sounds so.
Exactly.
It's so I mean, and this. I mean, how long did the Hobkirk Hill last? I mean, does it sound like a relatively short engagement?
Yeah, probably half an hour.
I mean, there's so much happening in such a short time, and it's interesting to think. We were referring to Camden earlier. It's such a tragic loss and so many casualties across both sides. It's amazing to think there weren't more casualties from Hobkirk Hill, but the more we start to kind of unfold the layers, you realize that's probably because so many different groups didn't really get involved the way you would have anticipated, and it probably reduced the number of potential casualties because there was less involvement.
Yeah, I mean, there's about 250 British casualties, 260, and a slightly higher number of Americans, but it's not a big number.
You would think it would be, for such a sort of quick but brutal clash, it would be much worse, but it sounds like a lot, as you said, some were crossing and it seemed like they barely met any resistance, so it's an interesting thing to think why they weren't getting involved, where all the disarray came from, if there was some sort of confusion that led to all that happening, but ultimately led to a continental loss, even though I think Greene maybe saw it in some regards as some measure of victory. Well, Greene did
that's interesting. His reaction is pretty interesting, depending on who you believe. In terms of what you said, the lower losses, of course, a lot of the American losses at Camden were inflicted by the British cavalry rounding up prisoners.
Absolutely.
The cavalry available to Rawdon was relatively few in numbers, far fewer than Greene had. So Rawdon noted that he could not make a pursuit. He tried to make an infantry pursuit, but you can't catch withdrawing men with other men on foot. So it didn't work. In terms of Greene's situation, there was a great account by William R. Davie, who was a partisan leader, North Carolinian. Greene made him his commissary officer, much to Davie's dismay, although he did a good job at it. He claimed that after Hobkirk's Hill, Greene said, "It's over. We have nothing to do, but we have to retreat west of the mountains and try to keep up a resistance there." No one else has ever corroborated this.
Interesting.
Greene could have been in the throes of despair. Now, Davie does say that shortly afterwards, Greene received word that Lee and Marion had captured Fort Watson, cut the supply line of communications between Charleston and Camden, so that part of his strategy worked.
Something went right.
Yeah, Greene does indulge a fair amount of self-pity after Hobkirk's Hill, and no more evidence of that. As I mentioned, Greene and Gates were not friends at all.
Yeah.
After the battle here, Greene actually writes unsolicited to Gates, actually opens a correspondence with him and says, the stain of my failure here is going to erase yours. You know, we're both in the same boat. We both got battered here at Camden, and he's sort of reaching out as a partner in sadness and defeat. And not only does he do that, he then writes back to Washington, to other correspondents of the Continental Army. He says, having studied the field at Camden and talking to the officers who were there, who are now in my army, he says, I see nothing exceptionable about General Gates' conduct. And then he writes to Congress and says, I don't have enough officers present to conduct a court of inquiry on Gates. I'm not going to do it. So that is a factor. Now,
an interesting one too. That's considering the stigma around Gates, particularly, even if it persists today. But at the time, the amount of pressure there was for Gates to answer for what I'd say what he had done, but I don't know. It depends on how you look at it, whether he'd done anything or not. But it's interesting that Greene sort of sympathized, I guess, and almost saw himself as more a failure than Gates had already been viewed. So that's an interesting point. And like I said, it's a very interesting factor at play.
Yeah, and it's a good thing Greene does snap back if he did indulge in that, William Davie's account, because shortly after the battle, a day or two after, Watson with the 500 troops from Georgetown arrives in Camden, and Rawdon, who even though he's 26 years old, and now he's got the whole burden of field command in South Carolina on him while Cornwallis is unknown to him going to Virginia. He takes Watson's 500 men, lets him rest a little bit, and then he marches north of Camden to see if he can't get Greene to fight. And Greene withdraws and uses the east-west streams and swamps for protection, so Rawdon can't get at him. And then Rawdon, of course, falls back. He knows he's lost Fort Watson, and that his supply line is cut. Fort Mott is being besieged now by Lee and Marion, so he can't stay here. So on the night of May 9th, he evacuates Camden, destroys all of the facilities except the hospital, all the military facilities, the fortifications. Not completely, because when Greene comes in on the morning of the 10th, Greene has his engineer, Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko, make a map of the town, a very famous map, so we know where the fortifications were. But then he orders the rest of them leveled, so that if the British repossess it, then make it more difficult for them to hold. And of course, he sets off eventually to 96.
Interesting things that Greene and Rawdon both lost and won almost with Hobkirk Hill, but from different perspectives, if you will.
Yeah.
You know, Greene, the idea that Greene would almost cut his losses and decide that it's time to move out is interesting, when he may have been able to. Is there any reason that he didn't? It sounds like there's obviously some reason, but why he chose to not retreat, but to fall back rather than regroup and try again and maybe catch Rawdon off guard, or see if he could try the plan again? Or is it just at this point, we know they know we're here, they know what we're out about, and we don't need to take another risk?
Yeah, I think Greene is very much like Washington. He has learned under Washington. Remember, he was not a professional soldier.
Very true.
And Washington's overriding rule, even when it cost him dearly in the opinion of Congress, in public opinion, in the morale of his own soldiers, always emphasized keep the army together and in the field as a symbol of resistance, rather than risking a battle that could be disastrous. Greene risked a battle that, by all means, on high ground and ground of your choosing, and being attacked by an enemy that you outnumber more than 3-2, should have been a victory.
Exactly.
And he lost. He doesn't come right out and say so much in his letters, but it's obvious he has a pretty deep respect for Rawdon's abilities as a field commander. Do you want to engage in a battle again where Rawdon may pull some kind of maneuver and flank you, or fall back a little and lure you into some kind of ambush situation?
You've been routed once.
Yeah.
Even though you may have a grand plan in your mind, the first time it didn't work. So that's a great answer. I was kind of hoping it would be something like that, because a lot of people may not realize that Greene was really a student of Washington, I think, in many ways, much like people like Lafayette, or a lot of parallels between Washington and other subsequent commanders under him. And Greene was absolutely no exception to that.
Yeah.
Greene, I always respected the fact that Greene did not want to put lives at risk unnecessarily. I ask that question also because I get the question a lot, well, why didn't Greene he regroup and say, this time we're going to be together, we're going to get it right? Well, it's not that simple. It's never that simple.
And once Watson arrives, now the two armies are roughly equal in strength.
And that changes everything. And you've got other victories to sort of dwell in elsewhere. It may not be here, but that makes a difference, especially when, subsequently you've got Rawdon evacuating shortly thereafter. So in some regard, the bigger picture is that you lose the battle, but you win the war ultimately because of that decision.
Yeah, Greene knows that Fort Watson has fallen. He knows Fort Mott is being besieged.
Right.
Sure, the British losses at those posts are relatively small, 80 men, 60 men, but it's true they can't afford to lose.
Doesn't he? If I'm not mistaken, doesn't Greene come back later?
Yeah, Greene comes through Camden in August of 1781 as part of his Utah
short
Springs
turnaround.
operation. Yeah, so he's here briefly in May before he sets off to another unsuccessful effort at 96. And who's his nemesis? Who leads British troops all the way from the outskirts of Charleston to the back country, but Rawdon to relieve the siege. Even though Rawdon by that point is seriously ill, his doctor says, I don't think he'll survive that maneuver. And so Greene does, at 96, risk an attack on the position, which fails. Rawdon comes in, relieves the siege, and does what he did after Hobkirk fell. He pursues Greene, who withdraws, and Greene again withdrawing behind one river or creek after another, and keeping a little ahead. It's hot, it's June. The British are tired. They had lost probably 50 or more troops on the march to sunstroke, heat stroke, as they were coming to the relief of 96. And again, another lesson that Greene learned, he had told Sumter to block the march route in case Rawdon showed up. And Sumter decided, I think Rawdon's going to be tricky and come on this road. So Sumter blocked the wrong road and ended up just going at the heels of the rear of Rawdon's column. So, but after that, of course, Greene goes to the high hills of Santee to rest his army. It's considered a healthy area, a little bit cooler. Right. The Rawdon now is left to go to Britain to recuperate, except his ship is captured by a French warship. So he's actually going to be in the French fleet as a prisoner at Yorktown, watching his former superior get beaten.
Seems very ironic.
Yeah.
It's,
and so Greene is at the high hills. The field command of the army falls to another Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Stewart. An interesting character, Major James Weems, who was involved in anti-partisan operations until he was injured at Fish Dam Ford and then became a staff officer in Charleston, wrote of Stewart that he was an altogether brave officer but too fond of the bottle. And Stewart, and he didn't write any reports to his superiors that he did know them have survived. He's all the way up here to McCord's Ferry. He's moving all around, back and forth. But he's on the west side of the Santee. Greene is on the east side. So even at times when they're only a couple of miles apart, they can't get at each other because there's no ferries or bridges or anything in that location. Henry Lee, who is scouting the British force, keeps constantly prodding Greene. They're weak. If you can get your strength, attack them. So Greene, finding he's going to be reinforced with some North Carolina Continental regiments, North Carolina militia, South Carolina militia, that Andrew Pickens is bringing, he calls Marion to him, decides he's going to engage the British. So he marches up the Santee partway, then cuts across to Camden, and he is here in late August for several days. He has some difficulty getting his troops across the river to the west side of the waterway to go down and engage Stewart, but that is his second visit here. And he actually, while he's here, he actually picks up some local militiamen to join the other South Carolina militia and they take part in the battle. They're unheralded, and part of that is because, like Daniel Morgan did at Cowpens, he only counted his Continental troops and a portion of the militia. Greene does the same thing at Utah Springs. He counts the Continental troops and he puts numbers on Marion's and Pickens' militia and the state troops that had formerly been Sumter's. But he actually has substantially more troops than he includes in his report. But again, when you strike an enemy and catch him completely by surprise, and then are driven from the field again,
it makes a tremendous difference in warfare.
But again, Greene does the same thing he did there. He tied up the British force. He made them suffer casualties they couldn't afford, and so
it seems Greene truly did fight a war of attrition. I mean, Greene, it's almost a running joke among a lot of people that Greene didn't seem to win. But Greene really is a fascinating guy because he knew his role, I think. He knew that even when he didn't win, he was making some significant impact in many instances. And the idea that Hobkirk Hill effectively pushed the British to evacuate was, even though he might not see it that way, was a major victory in a lot of ways. And, it seems like he could not stay out of Camden, whether he would, to his chagrin or not. I don't know if he was happy or sad about that, but if he was so bummed out after Hobkirk Hill, I don't know if he was too thrilled to be back again, but hopefully, it sounds like it wasn't as bad the second time around. But
No.
he,
And it is interesting to your point on the British victory. When Henry Clinton gets Rawdon's report of the battle,
right.
Clinton says, "We're saved. This is the most important victory of the war," because now whatever Cornwallis is doing, because Clinton doesn't know either. He's only the commander-in-chief. Why should Cornwallis inform him? And he won his subordinates. So Clinton said, "This is great. We've won. Rawdon beat Greene. Our position is secure in South Carolina," but of course it wasn't, and that was because Greene had the foresight, which, as I said to Gates' credit, he did try to do by reinforcing Sumter and sending Marion off to try to cut the supply lines. But of course, Marion, by this time, with the support of Lee's Legion, is a lot more effective than he was when he was just really getting into action in 1780.
Greene wasn't so much a one-trick pony. There were layers. I think that's another thing I always liked about Greene. He was a guy who, like you said, a great way to phrase it. I had the foresight to see that, if you have one plan, almost like the way Gates didn't have a lot of alternatives to the idea of Camden, like you said, trying to get in and just sort of egg them on. Do you want to get to the door and kind of knock until they finally go, "What do you want?"
Yeah.
Greene actually had other things going on, and like I said, with Fort Watson, that was a big victory too. That was a big part of it, depending on how you look at it. But we can sit here and talk about Greene all day. I think Greene's a fascinating guy. Greene wasn't just here. Greene was all over the place too.
Well, Greene understood logistics.
Absolutely.
Like few generals did. Gates didn't really have an understanding of it, and that influenced his movements. Rawdon did, because he had to get supplies from elsewhere, but he tended to allow logistics to limit him, whereas Greene adjusted to that. Splitting his army, taking part to Tehran, sending, from Charlotte, and sending the rest northwest under Morgan where they could subsist, taking a risk. And of course, that goes to the fact that when they had to reform the commissary service under Washington, Washington asked Greene to take that job. And Greene's response was, "It's going to destroy my military career. Whoever heard of a quartermaster in history?" But he did it, and he did the job extremely well. And so he understood the importance. And as he came down to the South on his way to replace Gates, he stopped and talked with Governor Jefferson in Virginia, Governor of North Carolina. He had spoken to Governor Rutledge, who was in exile in Philadelphia. He spoke to the Governor of Maryland. Said, "I need troops, I need militia, I need support." Didn't always get it.
He really got his homework, I guess.
But, and he told people, scout all the fords and ferries on these rivers as he went across North Carolina, crucial to escaping Cornwallis in the race to the Dan. Where can we put up a stock of provisions? Let's put these magazines, as they called them, where you kept food, supplies, ammunition, forage for the horses. And so he created magazines behind him, so he was able to operate even under adverse conditions. At least his soldiers wouldn't starve and they wouldn't run out of ammunition.
He tended to be well liked by his men, I believe. I think he was, from most accounts at least I've read, he was well respected by the soldiers, which was a big plus. Not every commander had the respect of their men to that measure. So that, I think, made a lot of difference, because a lot of those guys were willing to fight with him to the ends of the earth and back, because they knew he was not going, much like we were talking about earlier, he wasn't going to risk their lives, because it was ultimately his decision whether or not they made that move. And I think a lot of them respect the fact they knew he wasn't going to unnecessarily risk anything. And that's one reason why Greene tended to hold a lot of his, or not hold, excuse me, but maintain a lot of his forces, because he didn't take unnecessary risk. And I think that was one of the things that helped him to drive the British out of South Carolina. Well, he wasn't the only one, obviously, but was a big pivotal part of that.
Yep.
And Camden was a center point. It was absolutely a center point.
Yep.
So, anything you want to add? If you do, please do.
I think we've
We've covered a lot.
Well, yeah, we've covered a lot of ground today. So
we did. And before we end this, I just want to say, well, thank you again, obviously, Jim.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, always a pleasure to have you. Just talk to you and do these things, always a pleasure. And for anybody interested, and you should be, Jim has some wonderful books that you can pick up. We've got a couple up here on the mantle. Nathanael Greene, Battle of Camden. We probably could do a whole thing on Battle of Camden too. I think we will at some point. Three Peoples, One King, you name it. Google Jim, and I can't remember them all, to be honest with you, but you got some. I've read almost all of them too, and they are wonderful. I have learned a lot from them, and you guys go pick those up. And or come by the gift shop. We have a couple here in the gift shop. We'll hopefully get more. And next time we will be discussing foodways and horticulture for May. And we will see you guys May 1st. May 8th is our second Saturday event. So Jim, again, thank you for being here. And we will see you guys next time.